And we're live. Welcome back to the Things Not Named. I'm Joshua Doležal, and my series this year is based on one of Willa Cather's famous passages. She said that it's the presence of the thing not named that gives high quality to fiction, drama, and poetry. And so for my series this year on the medical humanities, I'm applying that principle to how we might all be more attentive to what goes on set in the clinic, in popular culture, and in the experience of illness from the patient's side. My guest today is Dr. Damon Tweedy, psychiatrist, author, and leading voice on race, medicine, and mental health. He's a professor of psychiatry at Duke University's School of Medicine and a staff psychiatrist with the Durham Veterans Affairs Health System, where he co-leads an integrated primary care mental health team. A graduate of Duke School of Medicine, he also earned a law degree from Yale Law School, focusing on health policy and medical ethics before returning to Duke to complete his psychiatric training. Dr. Tweedy is the best-selling author of Black Man in a White Coat, which takes a hard look at racism in American medicine. The book was a New York Times bestseller and was named a top nonfiction book of the year by Times Magazine. His latest book, Facing the Unseen, explores the struggle to center mental health within medicine and was recognized by Nature as one of the best science books of 2024. So thanks for joining me, Dr. Tweedy.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. And thank you, all of you who are joining in.
So as I've done in the past, we've got 10 folks already on the call, so that's great. If we get 30 or 40, that'll be even better. But I'll try to, if you just joined, I'll try to make a little bit of space as we talk for questions as they come up. So feel free to ask anything you'd like to hear more about, or if you've read either book, anything based on either book would be fair game. So, Damon, maybe we could start with your family origins. If I'm not mistaken, you and I are both first-gen college students. So
Yeah.
it was kind of a long road that you took from where you were born and raised to Duke and then also to Yale.
Yeah, so growing up, it didn't feel that way. But if you take looking back now, I'm 51, almost 52. It does feels like it was quite a journey. Um, but so I grew up in a two-parent home, mom and dad, both of whom traced their families back to Americans' origins, right? So back to the during segregation, even back to to slavery. Because I have an 1860 census. My dad showed me, of some of his relatives, and so they grew up and they're from Southern Virginia. Grew up in a very again, my parents are still living. They're elderly now, and they grew up during the time of segregation. Literally, the things that we read about in textbooks, and I mean that was their lived experience. The civil rights movement came to them when they were early 20s, so their whole formative years were in that space. And so that undoubtedly impacted how they, experience the world, see the world. And so for me, I grew up so my dad worked in like a grocery store, food store. Mom worked in a sort of government, sort of, kind of administrative, secretarial type work. And I had an older brother, and we were in a community that was all Black, literally 100% Black, very working class sort of Black community outside of Washington, D.C. Um, and, growing up, I was, kind of doing a bridge version. Back in those days, busing was still around. And so we were bused to a neighboring district that was all white. And so those are probably my first earliest kind of signs of, okay, you're different. And how do people what do people make of you by being different? And so for me, that difference was that, one was that I was mathematically, I was kind of really into math and numbers. I was sort of kind of an odd kid in that way, really into that. So I excelled in math, but we were bused to this school where we were, all Black kids bused to a school that was all white. And there were a lot of perceptions of teachers there about the Black students not being capable or being somehow, a problem, things that we sort of all hear about. And so for me, it was like, but I was finding myself in a space, but at the same time, I was a top student. And so people did kind of know what to make of me, the teachers and sometimes my classmates, because there were all these perceptions about what it meant to be a Black person, largely negative, right? And so I experienced that at a very early age. And from that standpoint, that sort of duality. When I got to high school, actually, so my middle school was like a local Black middle school, all neighborhood school. But then I tested into a magnet program in high school. maybe we can get back to this later when we talk about how do we move forward. But I got tested into this public magnet program. Little did I know at the time how powerful a school was in terms of some of the people who went there and what they achieved. But I was again it was a magnet school that was pretty much all white and Asian within a school that was otherwise black. And so I
Mm,
was in these magnet classes with white and Asian students, but I was part of but the rest of the school was mostly black. And there was always this sort of tension between where do I fit in these two worlds? And so that was sort of a common theme. And it played out a lot of really kind of, uh, um, crazy ways. One story I can tell real quickly that'll encapsulate this. In high school in 10th grade, I was in a chemistry class, literally the only black student in the class of 30 students. And one day, our school was a school of excellence, and so they brought in several leading politicians to our school to sort of talk about our tech program and how great it was. And so this time, this given my age, this was Governor Bill Clinton and people before he's president, and several people across both parties. And they sort of took them around our school to protect programs. So here I am, the only black student in that class. And before I get to that particular day, there's suddenly 4 or 5 other black kids in the class who were just sort of there, positioned. And
oh.
then can you see where I'm going with this? And then suddenly, as soon as these sort of political people leave, those kids are just kind of told to leave. And so I'm back here as the only black student in the class, and I'm looking around like, what the hell just happened? And like
Mm,
no one had any reaction. It was just like me. It was like no one else seemed to like get what had just taken place. And that sort of in some ways encapsulated kind of my perspective of being different.
yeah.
And having to navigate two worlds. And so that's kind of, and so really that's just my first book sort of starts with me being a medical student, but that's sort of the
Mm,
backdrop to that. And so when you get to medical school at a place like Duke, that's just accentuated that whole idea of two worlds. The world of the being the doctors, mostly white and Asian. Then there's the world of the patients in the community that you're around, which is largely black. And how do you
mhm.
navigate those two worlds? And so that was sort of the tension that I experienced at a young age, but it just really was accelerated in the medical setting. Because for me, part of what attracted me to medicine was the idea that it was objective, that it was concrete, it was data driven. It doesn't matter what you look like on the outside. A bone is a bone, your heart, a blood vessel is a blood vessel. And so that's part of what appealed to me is like I could contribute to
Mm,
society, but in a very concrete way. And so it was really kind of a shock to the system to get into medicine and realize that it was sort of in some ways the same old thing in terms of those,
mhm.
those, those problems that I'd experienced as a young person.
Yeah. One of the philosophers that I used in my dissertation was, Helen Longino, whose, iconic book is called, Science as Social Knowledge, kind of questioning this idea that science is just objective because it always
Yes.
takes place in a context that is
Yes.
social and that, certain questions get privileged and certain research gets funded and all of
Right.
that. Um,
See, I didn't
y
know any of that
yours
when I started.
Right, well, we're the same age, so I remember Clinton when I was in high school and all of that, so, um, yeah, it's rare to have increasingly rare to have someone who shares those those particular memories. 2 questions came up as you were telling a little bit of that story. One, you said that you tested into this program or into
Mhm,
this, school.
mhm.
I know that recently there's been some debate about whether, standardized tests are actually exclusionary, whether they set arbitrary barriers for diversity in college. And I know during COVID, a lot of those standards were just taken away. There was no screening really, or not the same kind of screening used for admissions.
Mhm.
And yet, I've heard other writers talk about this. Thomas Chatterton Williams is another one who
Yeah.
felt like standardized testing was the only way that he got noticed at all. That he would have been, lost in the cracks if it hadn't been for
Mhm.
some kind of merit based way of breaking through. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on that. Whether standardized testing is actually a way of bringing more diverse voices into medicine, or whether it's been kind of exclusionary.
I think it's a mixed picture. I think it depends on how you use it. I think that if it's used like a number in and of itself is doesn't it has to be. It's going to sound crazy to some people, but like yeah, number has to almost be contextualized. Like if you take, let's say you take an SAT score, let's just say 1,200, right? Now 1,200 is for depending on what your background is leading up to that place, that could be a not so good score, that could be an exceptional score, depending on what your background is and what you sort of had to overcome and deal with. So you think about my situation. First, parents did not go to college. Despite my mom's best efforts, I was sort of like you couldn't get me to read a book. I was kind of anti-intellectual because that's sort of like what was cool, and that was sort of the way in which everything it was sort of like the internalized message as a Black person was that these kind of books you're learning about in school about 18th century England, that's not for you. So why even bother?
Mm,
You know,
mm,
and so in some ways you're kind of, I mean, it's easy to sort of go down that path. And so you think about me getting a score like that. I mean, you know, that's a really, really given my background, that score may show a lot of potential. But if you compare the score to someone who's had all the sort of tutoring and I was even told when I was in middle school and early high school that you couldn't even study for the SAT. Like I was like, really? I mean, looking back now, I think really people told me that, but that's what I was actually
mhm.
told that you can't study for it. Obviously, there's a whole testing industry that would prove otherwise. And
Right.
so, if you compare people, so again, the score in isolation, I would say so if you're comparing someone like me with that score to someone who's had a much more privileged background, and putting us on the same level of footing, then I would say no, that's not great. But if you sort of contextualize for that person, what they, I had a mentor in medical school say, "What is that person's distance travel to get to this place? So what is the distance this person had to travel to get to that place?" Then I think the scores could be potentially very useful. So again, it's all about how you choose to use it. But if you just use it as a blanket number and say this is your value, then no, I think it could be more harmful than good. But so that's how I
Yeah.
use
And
it.
I heard Scott Galloway talking about that. That it used to be, you know, could you be kind of average and then get into an environment where you could become exceptional over time? But a lot of elite universities now seem to screen for these superhumans that are already
Yeah,
superhuman at age 17 or something. And yeah, it's a problem.
it's a
The
big
second
problem.
question, the second question from your background, you'd mentioned feeling kind of caught between two worlds. You didn't know quite where you fit.
Mhm.
And there's a saying about comedians, right? That they're all damaged people. And I think there's a similar saying about memoirists, which is that we felt dislocated or marginalized somehow, and that we try to write our way back into normalcy. I don't know if that is true for you, that the impetus to write
Oh,
your first book came from that
good.
sense of wanting to bridge the two worlds. Is that
Good.
accurate?
It is great. I never heard that exact. I heard that about comedians, but not about memoirists. But I will say it was an effort to make sense of what I'd experienced. Like I would have an expected. It all started writing, not even to I didn't start writing with the intent that I would one day be writing a book to the public audience. It's more about writing for my own sense of like, how do I make sense of this experience for me as an internally. I spent 8 weeks in a hospital setting. Again, patients often all Black, staff the opposite. I'm the only Black person. And I would always be caught in I found myself caught in these two different kind of spaces and not having so as I put in the book, having a one foot in both worlds, but not having 2 feet in either, and a sort of dislocation. And so it was kind of just a way to make sense of what I was experiencing initially. That's how it all kind of really got started. And then as I began to write a little bit more, I began to realize that there were aspects of what I was writing about that other people could connect with. And then it just sort of built upon, even if it's often Black people, but even beyond that, in other ways, people, because so many ways as you learn, there's so many ways which someone can be othered, right, or feel out, however the term you want to use. And I was able to feel like I could connect with people in other ways as well. So that's sort of how it kind of all sort of evolved. But it started as something to make sense for myself,
Yeah.
what I was experiencing.
Well, I had the pleasure of teaching Black Man in a White Coat. I used to be an English professor in Iowa before I
Right?
pivoted to independent writing and podcasting. But I loved teaching it, and students resonated with a lot of your stories as well, and learned a lot. They appreciated the research that you brought to it and the
Mhm.
historical perspective and things. What really struck a lot of them was the opening. So I wanted to talk about that first scene that
Yeah.
really kind of hooks the premise. Um, and I'd like to also maybe get into some of your influences, people that shaped you as you were
Mhm.
writing this, or models that you had, for the
Yeah.
book. Because the book doesn't come out of nowhere. You join a conversation about what it's like to be a doctor, and there's
Mhm.
a great body of literature on that already.
Yeah.
Um, Before we get to that, just in case anyone has just recently joined, there is a live chat. So if you need to ask a follow up question or just want to comment as we're talking, please feel free to do that. I'll try to create some space for questions as we go.
Yeah. So just to quickly that last point. As I got into medical school, and once I was there, I started getting interested in stories. Like it was fascinating to me that, in some ways, a story like a doctor could write about a 750 word essay about an experience in a clinic with a patient, and that could tell you can learn so much from that, and it could sort of it was a sort of way you could connect to that, and it could be a lot. I found ultimately it became more interesting in some ways than say like the latest New England Journal, study about comparing this drug to this placebo, and it was like, wow, these stories are fascinating. But what I noticed, and there were many books, the many writers who were really successful. I mean, we could go through a list later, um, and I drew on many of them. I mean, I have a whole library of books over here that's just nothing but medical memoirs in one row. What I thought that I brought to the table when I wasn't, looking back on is that those stories were set in big cities often, but there wasn't that dynamic of what is it like to be a black person, given our country's history, to experience these to be in these same rooms, and what were the tensions between patient and doctor that maybe someone who's not black and didn't have my experience growing up as I did, could sort of understand. So that's sort of how the book sort of I feel like the book sort of situates within that sort of literature of medical memoirs. Um, but as for like that story, so going back to that story, so I've already kind of laid out for you guys, some of the dislocation I kind of felt, and how medical school was thought to be this way in which I could kind of escape that. I initially started medical school thinking I'd become a cardiologist or an orthopedic surgeon. And it's from my mind very concrete, objective, enterprise. Blood vessel's a blood vessel, a bone is a bone, right? And that was sort of how I was thinking about medical school when I started. So in the background, of course, in mid-90s, affirmative action was, there was an earlier attack. There's always been attacks on, right? There's always, history repeats itself. So there was always a sense of like, you're in this place like Duke, and man, do I really belong here? My parents didn't go to college. I'm a black guy here. This guy next to me, his dad's a dean of, this law school. And this guy's mom owns a company. They're driving Mercedes and stuff to school. And like, man, I don't belong here, right? And they've all gone to like Ivy League schools, Princeton and whatnot. And so, what do I do? What am I doing here? So it was always that there. And then there was this early day, first few weeks of med school, first few weeks where, basically, um, I leave the classroom for a break, come back into, between lectures, come back into the classroom, and the professor confronts me in the room and says, "Sir, are you here to fix the lights in the room?" And I'm looking around like, who's he looking at? He's looking at me. And then I'm like, well, no. And he's like, well, yeah, but I called about this last week. Why haven't you done it? He sort of got agitated. He got irritable about it. He really kind of doubled down. And I'm like, whoa, what just happened here? And I had to why is this? Why is me? And I'm not someone who wants to just jump to the idea that race is always the reason why someone treats you a certain way. But I couldn't
Mhm.
couldn't come to anything else. It's like, wait, why else does this guy sit? I'm dressed the same. I got the same, sort of everything's the same as everyone else, except the obvious, right?
Mhm.
And so I was like, "Man, I hear it, and it always comes back to this," and so, how do you deal with that, right? And I thought to myself, you can't tell, and I'm a really big, tall guy. Am I gonna come back with anger? How's it gonna be received? Am I gonna be some, angry black guy who's looking to make everything a problem? And this guy was small, and so I could visualize how that could have gone south so quickly.
Mhm.
And so what do you do? I mean, just based on life experience. I mean, I can just tell you life experience that could have gone south really quickly. And so you kind of retreat, and you're like, man, what do I do now? This guy thinks it doesn't belong. This guy thinks I don't belong here, right? And so I had to it was like a test for me, like, do I belong here? And so I really kind of internally just like, maybe he's right. Maybe all these things are true. And so I just really kind of just I tapped into something I didn't know I necessarily had at that point in my life, where I doubled down and I studied like, hours around the clock, basically, almost literally. Ended up at the very end, got one of the highest grades in the class. And the way it worked back then is that you would meet with the professor at the end of the course. And then it was a weird thing because, I knew that at this point I'd done well. But then the professor, when he saw my score and he saw me, he did this double take, and he was like taken aback, and he started getting nervous and stumbling. And it was weird because it was like, in some ways I'd vindicated myself. I stuck it to him, if you will. But at the same time, it was like, you know, um, I'm different, right? And people are going to see me different. And no matter how much I think I'm just like everyone, I want to be like everyone else. I just want to be a medical student. I have to navigate this reality that people will see me differently, and I have to figure out how to make that work. And so
Yeah.
that was sort of the opening salvo to that journey.
Hmm. And he, as I recall from the book, offered you a chance to join his research team, and you wanted no
Like,
part
no
of that. Yeah.
thanks, no thanks. It was like it's sort of like a patronizing kind of thing, right? Because I think he remembered the first encounter in retrospect, and I think it was just so awkward, and it was like,
Yeah.
no, we just need to move forward.
Well, what you're describing, being seen as a certain way by professors, it didn't stop. Once you started practicing.
Mhm.
So there, and one thing I love about memoir writing, and your book in particular, is our lives happen to us in chronological order, but we don't have to tell everything that way in a memoir. We can
Right.
choose how we're going to order things, and so sometimes the way you place two stories side by side is, enlightening. And in
Yeah.
this case, you had a self-admitted white supremacist guy named Chester,
Yeah.
and then in the same chapter, you had a black man named Robert,
Yeah.
and neither one of them wanted you as their doctor. And so
Yeah.
that was a really interesting contrast, for
Yeah.
both of them coming from very different backgrounds
Yeah.
to draw the same conclusion. So
Yeah.
how did you why did you juxtapose them like that in the same chapter, and what did you learn from that?
So think about it. I think about, because at that point in the book, I'm an